In 1997, 14-year-old Reena Virk was beaten and murdered by other teenagers in British Columbia. 25 years later, the case still challenges the national conversation around bullying and racism, led by Virk's parents, who started campaigning against bullying in the wake of their daughter's murder. Could the details before and after her tragic death offer us an explanation as to why did this senseless crime take place? This is the story of Reena Virk. You know what? You know what? We live. We live. Can you guess the time? I finished work a minute ago. It is now 5:01 and I'm sitting here for a mic check. You owe me nothing and yet you owe me everything. Alright. Detective unit, all I have to say is get ready to rage. If you don't know this case, or if you do know this case and just want to know more details on it, because as you know I do deep dives on this channel, just get ready for your blood to boil with this one. I don't know what else to say, except to start this video with trigger warnings here. We are going to be talking about topics of bullying, and also we are going to describe Reena's murder in detail, so there will be some violent, brutal details of somebody's murder being described. So if that's not something that you want to listen to, if that's not something that you are in a mental headspace to commit to right now, I would say sit this one out. There are plenty of lighter topics on this channel. This case, as I mentioned, is quite important in terms of just conversations around bullying, and also when you actually do a deep dive both on the background and the aftermath of it, things kind of start falling into place. This is actually the main reason why I did it. I've heard of Reena's case for the first time actually a few weeks ago on Rotten Mango podcast. Stephanie So covered it, and it just didn't make sense to me. I wanted to really dig deeper into the case and to try to figure it out, because the motive never made sense to me. Like, this always seemed like a senseless crime, and it still does, even after I have done the research. But I feel like a lot of the pieces that I wanted clarified for myself, I have tried to clarify in this video, so hopefully it helps everybody. That said, this still to this day might be one of the most heartbreaking stories ever told on this channel. So we're not going to be starting this story with the perpetrators of the crime. We'll leave that for where they enter the timeline. We're gonna start with the Virk family, and not just with Reena and her upbringing, because here I dug deeper because I wanted to really understand the whole family dynamic and where she came from. And I believe this information, even though I found it online, is from her dad's book. So her dad, post Reena's death, wrote the book that is titled under her name, and he speaks about the family and about how the parents actually met. So today's story brings us to Victoria in British Columbia, and the time frame here is the 90s, when the Virks would be living there and when Reena would be born. So we are talking about suburbs in the west of British Columbia. They would be made up of working class families, meaning that the crime rate, especially in the 90s, was above average. So from the quick Google searches, I have looked for the district of Saanich, where the Virk family would be living in the time of the crime. Today, this seems to be a nice place to live. However, back in the 90s, kids seem to be living rough. They lived in youth homes or just rough on the streets. This wouldn't be the case for Reena. So she was brought up by her parents, Suman and Manjit. Manjit, her dad, is from the first generation immigrants from India, so he is of Sikh religion. And then her mom Suman grew up on Vancouver Island after her dad Mukand moved there from India's Punjab region in 1947. Reena's mom, in this interview that I hope to play, actually speaks about being born and raised in DC and how she was born to Indo-Canadian parents. However, because of the Indian background, because she was seen as minority, she speaks about how she was bullied based off of her ethnicity, but she dealt with bullying by ignorance herself.
Just want to speak a little bit about myself. I was born and raised in Victoria, BC, and I was born to Indo-Canadian parents. As a kid growing up, I was called names and teased about my ethnicity. Kids would call me stuff like Paki, Punjab, and other derogatory names. I learned to deal with this by just ignoring these people, chalking it up to ignorance.
This I find interesting because it sets the precedent for the whole story, that it's not just Reena who will experience bullying later on, but rather her family did in the past, and then how her mom chose to deal with it compared to how Reena will, but also the reaction. Just pin this in the back of your head, because the reaction that Reena's mom would have post her death is just exemplary. It's just something that I have not seen in many of these stories, especially from somebody who was bullied herself, and then knowing that her daughter's bullying actually led to her own death. But Reena's mom grew up as one of 5 children in the family, and after graduating, she started working for the government. The following year, after her graduation, is when she would meet Manjeet. And apparently, she was working shift work. She was working as a key punch operator between like 4 p.m. and 12, so around midnight. But Manjeet was there visiting his sister. And it is said that Suman was actually supposed to have an arranged marriage. She was supposed to marry somebody that her family decided she will marry. However, when she met Manjeet, they fell madly in love. In the book, Manjeet would actually say that it was not long before a family friend arrived, along with Suman, and this is how they would meet. A young woman who would change my life. He was immediately smitten. The two of them started talking often, and eventually the topic of marriage popped up. Now, despite Manjeet being Sikh, being from the Sikh religion, he would join his wife in practicing Jehovah's Witnesses beliefs. And the only thing this would mean for them, and really for the kids, when it comes to how this is related to the case, is that they wouldn't celebrate birthdays, nor would they celebrate any national holidays, meaning like no gifts really when it comes to those types of days for their children. Now, they decide to settle in View Royale. This would be the waterfront suburb in Victoria, British Columbia. And this is where, on the 10th of March 1983, the first of their 3 kids would be born. Her name was Reena, which actually means mirror.
She was born in 83, and then we had two more children, Simran, who was born in 85, and Amin was born in 88. Your firstborn child holds a really special place in your heart because you experience all the joys and happiness of welcoming a new being into the world for the first time. And the bond that you share with that child is huge.
Even though her mom would have 2 more kids, she would always speak how the firstborn child always holds a really special place in your heart. Her dad would say how he was always an involved dad in his daughter's life, and how him and Suman actually decided to have shift work so that they don't have to pay for babysitters, and one of them is always at home with the kids. And during the upbringing, of course, Reena and her siblings noticed that they are a minority. They noticed how they stood out from the rest of the population, especially in school. Once you start going to kindergarten and then school, it's very hard to ignore how others treat you. However, by all accounts, she had a really happy childhood, and all of the siblings did. She was not rebelling, she was listening to the parents, and they always made sure that somebody's there to take care of the children. However, as it is common when she hit teenage years, early teenage years, we're speaking like 12 and 13 here, Reena wanted to be seen as somebody who belongs. She was a minority, she already noticed how differently she is treated, so she started rebelling and not really paying attention to the parents' rules any longer. And one part of that is that maybe she finally saw the family teachings to be extreme, or rather just not normal. That, everybody's celebrating their birthday, she isn't. She isn't getting any gifts. Just Christmas, anything like that. So I looked a bit into Jehovah's Witnesses and rather kids and childhoods of kids in Jehovah's Witnesses families. And it really ranges from like what I have seen on Reddit, on forums. So it can be just like, hey, I suffered because I didn't get Christmas presents, or it can range towards nightmarish. Like kids going into the school and telling others how Satan is everywhere, controls everybody, how everybody's evil in this world. So here, by all accounts, it wasn't on the other end of that spectrum. It wasn't that extreme. It's just that they, just like so many other Jehovah's Witnesses, weren't celebrating any holidays. And maybe that is what provoked Reena really to start rebelling. She saw that maybe this isn't as normal. If everybody else in the school tells you, oh, or asks you rather, what did you get for Christmas? Or like, are you having a birthday party? And you're like, oh, this is how other people live. You feel like a minority within a minority. That is going to be really prevalent in this case, because it's not just her ethnicity, her race, her background that made her a minority, but rather now she is also a member of Jehovah's Witnesses. And it just adds a whole aspect to it, which is going to lead the kids to start bullying her. In terms of the extent of the bullying, I have only found this in one article, but most of it focused on Reena's weight and also on her race and just the background of the family. So the name calling was documented in the media, saying that she was told that she was pudgy and overweight. She was often called a beast or the bearded lady. The bullying was constant, it just wouldn't stop, and the parents started noticing how Reena was slowly falling into the depression because of it. So in May of 1994, they decided to move, and Reena would start going to another school. She would go to Burnside Elementary School. So her parents did this in hopes that it would stop the bullying, and at first it seemed like it was working. Reena sort of became more social and she met a new friend. She was excited about this. However, this friend suddenly started ignoring Reena and then others followed suit. So again, Reena became distraught and the bullying, even just in this school, still continued. In 1996, despite of the bullying, Reena would still graduate elementary school. And now she was to go to Colquitt's Middle School. And just picture yourselves in between the schools, right? Like primary, secondary, whatever the system is, wherever you're based. You kind of start thinking about like what have you done before that maybe didn't work, or like what kind of friends do you want to make now, what kind of person do you want to be seen in this new environment, because finally it's a completely new page. You can be whoever you want to be, or so you think in your head. So here, this is again my speculation based off of my personal experience, but I feel like this is the mentality that Reena went into the middle school with, because here she decides she's going to turn a new page and she immediately starts befriending the cool kids, quote unquote, in school. She started staying past her curfew. She also started drinking and smoking. And she even started wearing the loose style clothes that were modeled on the gangs of LA. So finally, she feels some sort of acceptance because of how she was behaving, her friends started actually seeing her as part of the friend group. I need you now to step out of Reena's shoes and put yourselves into her parents' shoes. Because of course, now that Reena has completely changed her behavior, her parents are not going to be happy about it. They're not going to be happy that she's missing the curfews that they have set up for her, that she had completely changed who she is, her style, and everything about her in order to fit into this new friend group. So they started disapproving of Reena's habits. And Reena decided to start acting out even more. So she goes to the friends group and she complains about her parents, about how strict they are, about how they're trying to control everything about her life. And this is when one of the parents suggests, listen, Reena, the only thing that you have to do is report one of them or both of them. Fuck them, fuck the parents. Report one or both of them of physical abuse. The police is going to look into it inevitably because you're a minor, and then you will end up in foster care. And some of these kids, because of how rough it was to live in that area in British Columbia in the 90s, were already there. They were either in foster homes or youth homes, which is kind of like a step up. However, in foster homes, from what I have seen or just read online at that time, you wouldn't have those curfews. You wouldn't really have anybody controlling your life. So of course, Reena is like, well, this is perfect. You know, first of all, I will still remain part of this cool friends group here, but also I won't have to live with my parents who are imposing all of these on me. I might finally be able to celebrate my birthdays, to actually live my life the way I want to live. So she decides to report her dad, Manjit, of sexual abuse. And again, because she is a minor, obviously the police takes this seriously. So they are questioning Manjit and they arrest him for sexual abuse against Reena. And he gets put into jail awaiting arraignment. Eventually, Reena would be placed into foster care, yes, but also she told the police that she lied about the abuse. And in his book, Manjit would say, I now believe Reena manipulated social workers and family alike. And in his book about this, Manjit said, I now believe Reena manipulated social workers and family alike. It was killing me that no one believed us, and everyone seemed to accept Reena's stories. Due to the reports of the abuse, I actually believe Reena was first placed into the care of her grandparents, while they investigated obviously both mom and the dad, but then she complained how she's uncomfortable in the grandparents' house, and finally that led to her being placed in foster care the way she intended to. But then it seemed like she actually did end up having a curfew and being controlled in the foster home where she was placed, so she decided. But then it seemed like at the foster care home where she was placed, she actually did end up having a curfew because of her age, and also they gave her chores. So she was unhappy with that and she decides to return to the family home. She apologizes to them and they just forgive her and accept her back. After spending some time back at the family home, however, she decides, well, the rules are back, I'm not really satisfied with this, and based off of what her friends are telling her, well, maybe foster homes aren't for her. However, what about youth care homes? So here she would have no chores, she would have no rules, and she had heard she would have no curfews. But this is also the place where the friends of hers are living, and the friends of those friends, and those are all the kids with behavior problems or the kids that have nowhere else to go, whereas Reena does have her parents' home to go to. She has the grandparents, she could stay literally at anybody else's place, she has where to be, whereas these kids are literally in youth homes just in order not to be on the streets. Once she moved to the youth home, and here, never forget, we are still speaking about somebody who is between the age of 13 and 14. The worst years when it comes to school and just fitting in general. You're trying to find yourself, figure out who you really are, who you really fit in. This is a new school, this is a new environment. It's hell on earth to begin with, without putting yourself under this much stress. And still trying to fit in, Reena starts missing school more and more. She starts partying and committing minor acts of vandalism. Allegedly, at this point also, and probably in order to fit in, she stole a boyfriend of one of the girls that would later become relevant in this story. This woman's name is Missy Grace Pleash, or known in the court documents as MGP, because if karma doesn't find you, trust me, I will. There are so many names here that are protected by the court documents. This girl's name is not one of them. And she was allegedly angry at Reena at this moment in time for stealing her boyfriend. This happened as she's living in the youth group home with Pleach and also with another girl that we will mention in a couple of minutes. So it is suggested that Reena might have done this and a couple of other actions when she was still at this youth home with this group of friends in order to assert herself as tough, in order to finally stop herself from being bullied when it came to this group of people that she surrounded herself with. This will be physically and mentally where Reena would be at the time of her death. She will be in her youth home, sometimes staying with her family and befriending some people from this youth home. Some of them would go to school with her, some of them she would just meet at these parties, some of them would be complete strangers, and then she would meet them at these parties. But this is where we will pick up in the story. Before we pick up in this story, I have to introduce you to two other characters and speak about, again, mentally and physically where they were at the time in order for any of this to make any sense. The first person we have to speak about is called Warren Glowatsky. He was born in April of 26, 1981 in Alberta in Canada. And Glowatsky had a pretty unstable background. His parents never married, but they stayed together for the child. If your parents have ever told you that, trust me, they're not staying there for a child. Especially if you are the one asking them to get divorced and they're telling you, oh, we're staying there for the children. You're like, make it make sense. Personal story, a bit triggering? Yeah. His mom was an alcoholic though, and she was supposed to be the one raising Warren. However, due to her alcoholism, the father decides to get out of the picture and leave the family alone. Now, when they were together, Warren and his parents also moved often, so they lived quite a transient lifestyle as well, which obviously means for the early childhood, hell on earth. Like trying to establish a friend group, you can't. Your parents are already unstable. You just have no stability in any part of your life. Not an excuse, not an excuse. Just sort of the background and trying to understand the psychology of this person. In 1996, because of this transient lifestyle and because of his mom's alcoholism, Warren would move in with his dad only. And this would be in Nanaimo, British Columbia, on Vancouver Island. In 1997, Warren would settle with his dad near Saanich in British Columbia. However, this would be in a trailer home. So still, he's now in his teenage years and living a very unsettled lifestyle. He, despite of that, manages to actually find a girlfriend in school, and this would be his classmate called Sarita. Sarita, interestingly, would actually be on the scene of the crime, but rather before the crime took place. So she was under the bridge when Reena was murdered, but she felt sick, she felt ill, and she decided to go home. Rather, she actually asked Warren to take her home, but he would decline, and later he would say how he regretted this. So even though now supposedly Warren has settled, at least he's in one place, right? He's with a stable parent, he's in one place, he has a girlfriend. But what some didn't know is that Warren actually was affiliated with a local gang. Rather, the gang was called Crips. Now, I don't know anything about gangs, but this is apparently a really famous LA gang, Crips and Bloods. Well, Bloods is the direct rival of them. And these gangs then don't just operate in one area, rather they have their networks in different parts of the country. So this would be the local gang for British Columbia. But obviously what this meant is that Warren started also changing in appearance, kind of the way that Reena did. He started wearing gang's trademark colors, and he was also initiated into it when he was involved in a beating. I find this to be interesting because on one end we have Reena who is trying to fit in and she's trying to assert her dominance in a certain way, but purely for the reasons of herself not getting bullied every single day, purely for the reasons of having friends in her life. And here we have Warren who is seemingly trying to assert his dominance and be tough, probably for other reasons, knowing his unstable background, also wanting to fit in, but probably seeing gang as maybe the only option for himself because he's a guy in that area. What else can he do? And this might be the worst moment for him, or rather his dad, at this point as the second parent in the picture, to decide to leave. He just up and left. He married this woman in Las Vegas. The article actually makes it sound like this was like Ross and Rachel's wedding in one of those chapels, and then they were like, oh, okay, well, now we are married and I have a son and I want to move to California with you, and now I have this son in a trailer, so I'm just gonna ask him if he wants to come along, and if not, I'll leave him behind, because it's not like, his mom abandoned us, like I should abandon us as well. And that's what he does, because Warren, because of his girlfriend, doesn't want to leave with his dad. So he stays in the trailer. And the dad keeps like sending him checks every week or every few weeks. But then Sarita's mom, the girlfriend's mom, kind of takes pity on him. And she takes him in, starts cooking for him, and just washing his clothes, making sure that somebody's taking care of this child. So this would be where Warren is mentally at the time of the crime in 1997. His dad abandoned him after the mom had already left, so he has no parents. Eventually, from what I have seen, also his girlfriend will ask him to leave. So he's kind of sleeping between friends, like friend to friend, and just still living in very unstable circumstances. Now that you know a thing or two about Warren, we need to speak about the second person who will definitely not be protected by the court records and who will be one of the more rage-inducing people in any story I have ever covered. Her name is Kelly Ellard, and by plenty of accounts online, there's really limited information on Kelly, and I really had to dig deep. She was, unlike Warren, actually from a stable, supportive family. She wasn't known to be a troublemaker all the way up until her early teenage years. But according to psychologists, rather Emma Kenny's video that I have watched on this case, she had latent predispositions, meaning that there was always the opportunity for somebody to become rather their true individual self, and for their true nature to showcase to the world. And Kelly's true nature would be the one of a sociopath. I have, as I mentioned, desperately tried to find something to explain why Kelly would behave in such a way, why she would exert such violence towards another human being, and the most detailed account of events that I could find on her is through the Canadian True Crime podcast. So this is one of the early episodes. I have no idea where they found this information, but we are lucky to have it because it's the very few details that we know of Kelly. So Kelly was born on August the 9th, 1992. She was described through her childhood as a good kid who ended up being devastated by her parents' divorce. The parents apparently divorced when she was only 8 years old. And we never learn of the identity of the dad. Her mom ended up remarrying to a coach, and she said that Kelly always behaved. She never rebelled, she never missed a curfew, how she loved pets and poetry. Kelly would choose to hang out with the rough crowd, however, in her early teenage years. She ended up being suspended twice from school. Once it was because she damaged the school bathroom, and the other time is because she drank alcohol in the same or another bathroom in that school. And just 3 months before Reena's murder, in August of 1997, Kelly lured a girl to a remote spot, then ended up beating her and tried to set her hair on fire. So apparently here she wasn't the instigator though, even though she held a knife to this girl's throat and then like a group of them tried to set this girl's hair on fire. So she was known as disruptive with violent tendencies, however she was never charged. Something that's important to know in this story is that Kelly here is only 15 years of age. All of these kids would be teenagers at the time, and neither Kelly nor Warren knew Reena personally. Neither of these two have actually met her before the night of her murder. But those two, as I mentioned, would not be protected by the court, meaning that those two would be the ones perpetrating the crime. However, that brings us to someone Kelly did know, the person that was her best friend. That again The initials were stated in the court documents, but just like with Pleach's name, Grace Pleach, we also know the name Nicole Cook. So Nicole and Kelly were the best of friends. I mean, as good of friends, I think, as you can form with a teenager. There was a lot of gossip involved. Let us go into the classic Mysteries with Maya rundown. So the short of it and then the long version, breaking down every single detail that I could dig up on this story. The short of it was that Reena was invited to a party on the night of November the 14th, 1997. Her friends invited her to a party behind the Saanich school. But when the police ended up breaking the party up, they would move towards the Craigflower Bridge. Reena actually wanted to stay at her family home that evening, so she ended up calling her parents at 10:40 p.m., 20 minutes before her curfew. And she told them she is on her way home. She's not going to stay at the youth home that evening, she will go to her family home. And this would be the last time that Reena's parents heard her voice. So how this party came about in the first place? So we have to speak about the best friends, Nicole and Kelly. This is a sideline, but if anybody grew up in Canada during this time, I would just like to hear from you in general when it comes to the comments, but especially here because I was thinking about why their names weren't protected, because everybody else, we just know the initials. And when it comes to Nicole and Grace, we actually know their full names. From what I can gauge, it is because they were more involved when it comes to this case. But I don't know that for sure, because the other girls were involved in a beating. I think these two were involved in the beating and the cover-up, and that's why the courts just couldn't actually protect them. But let me know if you know that for sure. So in the months before the murder, Kelly was actually very friendly with the other blonde, delicate girl. This is how they describe Nicole Cook. Out of the two, apparently Nicole was more charismatic, she was more confident. Both of these girls, however, obviously had something to talk about, right? For them to be best friends, they had to bond over something. What they bonded over was their interest in gangster rap, in serial killers, and a mafia boss called John Gotti. You know, the typical teenage interest. Mafia bosses. It's very niche, very niche. Like, there is a whole, is it hybristophilia? The obsession with serial killers that is concerning in itself, but this is even more niche somehow. So they would boast of stealing cars and dating Crips, dating people from the gang, the local gang in the network. Nicole would boast of dating the local members of the Crips and also of stealing cars in the area. And Kelly was said to keep different drawings in her lockers. Drawings of severed hands, of disembodied heads, and of gangsters, again, probably local gangsters, shooting police officers. This disturbing sketchbook or a notebook, whatever you want to see it as, that Kelly kept, however, isn't the one that is crucial in this case. A lot of people who are trying to make any sense out of this story, make any sense out of why Reena had to die, as I mentioned, are focusing on a different one. And this is more of an address book that Nicole had in her possession. And if you remember, Nicole lived in a youth home. Actually, I don't know if I mentioned that. Nicole and Grace Pleach lived in the youth home. And this is where, as I mentioned, Reena was staying at the time. So in between youth home and her family home, and this is where they befriended her. So Reena, again, whether it is the attempt to look tough, whether it is attempt to assert dominance, steals Nicole's address book, and she actually called some boys that were in it. She told them that Nicole wasn't as beautiful as she thought. She started also spreading some rumors that Nicole might have had AIDS, and how her eyebrows were fake. So it probably ranged call to call from what I could assess. Again, not trying to make it seem like Reena wasn't in the wrong here. This is reported by a lot of articles. However, what proceeded was probably the most overreactive behavior that you will hear about. And again, I don't think it is the true motive behind the murder. Would this have enraged you or anybody really, for somebody to just take your address book, call people, especially in high school? Even today, if somebody was to call people from, I don't know, my phone just at random, telling them like, oh, hey, Maya has AIDS, I'd be fuming. However, then there are other options, there are other avenues that you can explore. You can talk to that person, you can even like report them for spreading rumors. You can deal with it in rational ways. Well, of course, here we're not going to be talking about a rational person. What Nicole decided to do is call her friend group and organize a beatdown. And this beatdown was obviously going to be the party that Reena was invited to. She had even overheard from some articles that I have read that somebody's getting beaten up that evening. And obviously, trying to fit in, Reena decided to still go because she didn't suspect that it's going to be her. And again, from some articles, I have heard like she would kind of even ask Nicole and Grace, like, oh, who is it that's getting beaten up? Like, is it me? And they would be like, no, of course, like, you'll see, you know, once we actually get to the party. So this is how they lured her in, with a pretext of a party at supposedly the location where it usually would happen. However, Nicole knew that this was supposed to be a beatdown. There is speculation that a lot of people who appeared didn't. So there were only a certain amount of people who actually knew what the plan was, and that Reena was one of the people that overheard about it. One of the people that most probably did know about this party and how it was supposed to be a beatdown rather than just some teenagers gathering and drinking was Kelly. Apparently, a few days before the murder, Nicole's mom overheard her speaking to the phone with her best friend, Kelly. It only makes sense for Kelly to have known because she was Nicole's best friend. And they were talking about digging a grave and burying a girl in it. Her mom just decides, oh, typical Nicole, doesn't do anything about it and just lets her go on that Friday night in November, just lets her go out. According to this Vice article on this case that I have read, on the Friday night in November, a Russian satellite broke apart in the sky. I tried to look this up. There was a Russian satellite in the sky in November, but not on this date, and it was Sputnik. I don't think it was in Canada. But listen, who am I to spite Vice, okay? I'm not gonna spite some professional journalists who clearly know what they're talking about. So 50 to 60 teenagers gathered behind this Saanich school. And on those nights, usually it's everybody from like the skater boys to the pretty girls to the cool girls, including Nicole, including Grace, including Kelly, Warren, and Reena. And all of them, according to again Vice article, nearly all of them were unaware of the plan that Kelly and Nicole had conjured up. Most of them had never met Reena before. So they just decided to, I don't know, go and watch the satellite in the sky and probably get high while at it. What Nicole might not have expected, actually it would be really interesting to know if she even had a plan, if the two of them actually put the two and two together, like they have step one, step two, step three, because it doesn't seem like they did. However, what I don't think she expected here was for the police to show up to break this party up. This is now 50 to 60 teenagers behind the school. Somebody's going to file a noise complaint. So they did, and now a smaller group of teenagers is moving towards the beach, towards the Craigflower Bridge. And this is a damp, cramped area with graffiti on concrete. It looks sinister, and it's kind of, even at the time, I don't know what it's known for today, if it's known for anything else apart from this crime, but at the time this was known as a rough area. It was known as the area where beatings would happen. As this group of teenagers is now on the beach, this is when Nicole decides to call out Reena for spreading rumors about her. And Reena, in an attempt to act tough, to sort of assert dominance, calls Nicole a bitch. And then she gets up to leave. She has called her parents, told them she's gonna be coming home for her curfew. However, of course, Nicole is not going to just let her go. She was smoking cigarette at that moment in time, and she decides, and in my head this is planned, this was a clear signal for the things to escalate. She takes that lit cigarette and puts it onto Reena's forehead. And this is obviously leaving a visible mark, however, it's also humiliating for Reena. And as she tries to cry out, she tries to act, 6 girls and 1 boy tackle her to the ground, and the beating begins. And Nicole would be interviewed. I couldn't find this interview anywhere to play it here, but I could find a transcript of it. She was interviewed for a documentary called Bloodlust Under the Bridge. And Keith Morrison asks her, would the murder have ever happened if you hadn't started a fight by burning her face with your cigarette? Nicole said, I don't know, maybe. The moment that Reena gets up, the moment that the cigarette is actually put onto her forehead, the pack mentality kicks in. It was later said in the court that Warren approached Reena while she was lying on the ground and kicked her twice in the head. A friend of his told him to stop, telling him that this isn't his fight, and the fight in total would last for 3 to 5 minutes, until one girl finally called for it to stop. However, this is 7 people and 1 defenseless victim on the ground. They're kicking her, punching her, mostly in the head from what I have read, and they have also made sure to take her belongings. So they have taken her rucksack, including her bus pass. Like, the bus pass was in her rucksack, and this was her only way of getting home. So you can just try to put yourself in the mindset of Reena while she's on the ground, being beaten, while she's defenseless. People have spread the contents of that rucksack in the water. She's thinking, even if I make it alive, how am I getting home? Like, first of all, how do I make it alive? How do I get up from this position? But then even if I do, somebody dumped my contents. I'm left here defenseless to die. Finally, this kickboxer calls for everybody to stop, that it's been enough. So the group disperses. All of them just leave Reena lying on the ground. Some of these kids would later in court say that Reena was still alive. She was lying in mud, she was bleeding and crying, and none of them offered to help her. What they would also later say, however, is when they started moving towards their homes, well, they have seen Reena get up and kind of stagger on the bridge when headed home. Pin this into your head, because this woman has just been beaten for at least a couple of minutes by 6 or 7 individuals. In most articles they are dubbed Shoreline 6, but then in some I have seen that Warren is kind of counted as like a separate entity because he was a guy and it was actually 6 girls. From what I've seen, they have been dubbed Shoreline 6, and it's 6 individuals that have been charged eventually with this beating and murder. But these foster care kids or youth home kids now, they catch a bus home, they have to get back by the curfew time, and they're saying Reena is still alive. No, she has actually gotten up and is headed her own home. She's headed to her own house, staggering, beaten in the head multiple times. She's headed home. But 2 individuals don't go home. They don't go to their own home, they don't go to the girlfriend's home, they don't go to the youth home. And those 2 individuals were Kelly Ellard and Warren Blavatsky. They ended up following Reena. So they reach her, apparently on this bridge. This is why I don't believe this whole story, because I don't believe that Reena was in the state where she could just have gotten up and staggered and decided, no, I'm gonna walk home, when she had to take a bus to actually reach it. So apparently Kelly was the first one to reach her, and she starts a confrontation by asking Reena if she's going to rat her out, creating yet another escalation, because whatever Reena is to say, there's no escape. So Kelly would make her take her shoes off, and then Kelly and Warren start attacking her again. They kicked her, they stamped on her body and her head, and finally Kelly would end up smashing Reena's face into a tree. This is when the 2 of them decide they have to reach the water. So they drag Reena's body, they take her sort of like by one leg each, and they drag it to the water's edge. And at this point, Reena was unconscious, and it is said that like her trousers as well fell off as the 2 of them were dragging her. So This is when Kelly decides to give her one last chop to the throat, and she starts holding Reena's head under the water. We can really only speculate on what injuries happened here. What kind of beating? Did it happen on the bridge or did it happen under it? And I think a lot of us believe that Reena never got up, that she never actually was in the position to stagger and to go across the bridge. And we believe that because of one such autopsy report by Miss or Mrs. Gray. I don't actually know, was she married or was she not at the time? But this is going to explain to you just the extent of the injuries. Whatever beating Reena had received, her injuries were severe. And Gray was the one to perform the autopsy on her. What's important to know is that according to Gray, Reena maybe would have survived the first attack, however, definitely not the second one due to the brain trauma. Dr. Gray said that the extent of Reena's injuries included severe bruising over her entire skull, forehead, ears, and cheeks, that Reena's brain was swollen, and there was an imprint of a running shoe on her head. That Reena's brain was swollen, and that there was an imprint of a running shoe on her head, consistent with a stomping or a kick. She also found severe bruising to Reena's pelvis, stomach, liver, and pancreas. And somehow, most morbidly, because you can imagine this so vividly, Gray found pebbles lodged in Virk's throat, which is consistent with someone drowning face down in shallow water. She also testified that if Reena hadn't drowned, it was unlikely she would have survived the brain injury. So her cause of death when she was found would be drowning. And it was said and later exposed in court that her head was kept underwater for at least 10 minutes. This obviously couldn't scientifically be proven, but Dr. Gray said there were 18 pebbles in Reena's lungs. And the presence of so many small stones also in her lungs led her to believe that she was alive when she was brought into the water. And something that Dr. Gray, who has no bullshit, and I love this person, has also said is that she maintained that Reena wasn't crossing the bridge. That Reena was in no position to cross that bridge. That she had sustained such severe injuries, she would have been unconscious or in so much pain that she wouldn't have been able to move. Basically, that all of these fuckers are just trying to save Grace, that they're just trying to save themselves. Which begs me to think, have they even seen that Reena was alive? Or have they all left her for dead? Because that's what enrages me. There's so many people that have been protected by the court records here that are just living their lives that were involved in this. Just completely moved on, have probably never thought about this, never given it a second thought. And I'm thinking whether or not they have actually just left that scene of the crime thinking that Reena was dead, that she was dead on the ground. Have they seen her crying? Have they seen her just being in the mud, getting up and crossing the bridge? Well, the person who conducted the autopsy on her doesn't believe so. At this point in the evening, it is now past 11 p.m. So Reena's parents are panicking because her curfew had come and gone. So they start calling her friends and they decide to call the Saanich police. The police, of course, here, because we are talking about the minorities, would decide to refuse to classify this as a missing persons report, because they had probably already known Reena's name because of the reports against her parents, so they started treating this as a runaway case due to her past behavior. Now, parents are frantic the whole weekend, and they decide to go to the foster home. And the foster home kids, however, well, they have places to be, because we are talking about Kelly's best friends, right? We are talking about Nicole, and then we are talking about one such Missy Grace Pleach. So remember those two? Yeah. Well, Kelly, of course, ordered everybody to zip it, not to say a word, but she also was one out of the two people that were the main perpetrators, right? So she probably told them what they should keep their mouth shut about, yeah. And they probably all knew at this point that Reena was dead. So she told her best friend and also Pleach that they need to dispose of the evidence. Yeah, there was still some evidence that they had to dispose of. So the girls went to the beach, Grace and Missy. They went to the crime scene the day after the killing, accompanied by Kelly, and they actually took Reena's shoes and sweater. They take those items to the youth home and they find some younger girl, obviously somebody they could exert dominance against again, and they force her to hide the items for them. Just no, don't dispose of the items. Listen, it's good that they're stupid. It's really good that they're fucking stupid. They force this same girl then to call the parents. This is just evil. The parents of Reena's, and to tell them that she was still alive. Like, oh, she just doesn't want to speak to you, but you know, we have definitely seen her and she's definitely still alive. Now, once those items have been taken to the foster home, all of these girls swear to secrecy. Because we know, yeah, definitely know, spread a rumor and then swear to secrecy. Make sure that the rumor is spread to as many people as possible and then all of them just swear to secrecy. Has nobody watched Pretty Little Liars? Has nobody watched Gossip Girl? This was one of the shows at the time. Has nobody watched Charmed? So at this moment in time, Reena's parents are freaking out. The girls are lying to them. They know that Reena has not been seen by anybody, that she would have reached the family, reached out to them by this point, and they're trying to dispose of the evidence and keep a secret. As for Warren, because he, as I mentioned, didn't know Reena, and also just wasn't associated with this group. Something I couldn't find actually was his association with Kelly. I couldn't find that they were mates of any sort. It just seemed like he was a complete outcast that also was just maybe hanging out with them, maybe knew Nicole because she was dating Crips, and like kind of was loosely associated to this group. But I don't think that he had like any strong affiliations to any of the girls that were involved here. However, he still had that girlfriend of his. So he decides the next day to show up at his girlfriend's house and he asks her to bleach the blood out of his pants. On his knees, he confessed that he actually followed Reena Virk with Kelly and that something happened, that Kelly did something to her. It's safe to say that by Monday, the whole school knew, including the teachers. And this is something that is so irrational in this point in time, that the teachers were hearing rumors about this, that they must have heard it from the people in school, that like people in youth homes, anybody taking charge of these women, like saw some suspicious actions. They saw all of these women like hiding all of that evidence and nobody went to the police. So teachers hear about it on Monday, they don't report it. But finally, because of all of this gossiping in the youth home, two of the girls actually overheard Nicole and Pleach speak to Kelly, speak about hiding the evidence, forcing this younger girl to hide all of this evidence for them. So they actually, after overhearing one of the conversations, finally go to the police. And the police finally starts taking this seriously. This is where I would like us to pause before we go into the aftermath, because we are only going to feel some more rage. And I'm going to pause here to try to answer the question, because one question will always remain in this case, and that is why. This crime was senseless. Her actual murderers might not have even had any affiliation, might not have known each other at all. They didn't know Reena personally. They had no reason to act on revenge, even if we believe that it was Nicole's revenge that was basically the motive for this murder, that like she humiliated her and this is why this has been instigated. But is it for spreading rumors? Is it for stealing someone's boyfriend? I really doubt it. I think this is more to do with the pack mentality and with everybody having to be seen as tough and then deciding, well, we can't rat each other out because that would severely impact our social status in this kind of case. If nobody is arrested, nobody goes to prison, we are safe. Warren himself was a lone wolf, as were the kids that actually probably had a reason to be in the youth home. And then there was one person with sociopathic tendencies to top it all off. Something that we can't erase in this case is gender, nor race of the victim. Not in the family, where generationally women have been bullied. I have found multiple essays on this case because people have analyzed it for their degrees online, and I just like to read out something that I have found out of one of them on the case of Reena Virk. The violence committed against Reena Virk for transgressing heterosexist and racist codes and boundaries was enacted as murder because, as a young South Asian woman, Reena was racialized and therefore dehumanized. She could not be recuperated into the racial and gendered identity of girlhood. No amount of correction would make Reena into a white girl. This was a punishment with the aim of annihilation. The youth who attacked and killed Reena Virk carried out what they perceived as a logical expression of their outrage against a young South Asian woman who wanted to survive. So I would like to know, do you agree with me that this was more of a pack mentality? That they planned this to get a kick out of it? Or rather not even planned. They only needed to be one instigator, or rather two people that really planned this. There was an action of the cigarette being lit on her forehead, and then there was a reaction. And then everybody else chipped in order not to look less tough than the other person. But why the two of them killed her? And this is, again, something that we don't have the insight of, because if the two of them actually did step away, let's just say, like, how the story would have flown, like, after the first fight, after Reena is left on the ground. Is she left on the ground in the first place? Or has everybody here lied? That is truly my question here, because I can't imagine, like, everybody just dispersing, saying, like, oh yeah, Reena is walking on the bridge, and then the two of them following her, dragging her down back to the same spot. What are the two of them talking about? Have they not left their own ways? Have they left by themselves, like together? What are these two individuals that apparently haven't been associated up until this point talking about? Like, why are they talking themselves into going back to kill Reena? Or what are they talking? Like, how did they will themselves to go back to the scene of the crime? The potential motive here for me is that she doesn't talk. That they wanted Reena not to talk, not to rat them out, and if there is any chance that she is left alive, she might talk. So maybe they returned to check up if she was alive, to intimidate her further. Maybe the plan wasn't to murder her. However, knowing Kelly's previous history, maybe Kelly's plan was always for Reena not to make it out alive. But if I'm even partially right, if even part of it was for them to silence Reena so she doesn't rat them out, so they don't suffer any consequences, well, then they shouldn't have really blabbed, because the youth homegirls came forward with the names and the location, which led to Glowatsky and Ellard, so Kelly and Warren, finally being arrested and charged with murder and aggravated assault. And this happened on November the 21st, 1997. So this was a week after the crime. And this means Reena's body is yet to be found. However, the girls have actually told the police a couple of things. So they have told them the names of the Shoreline Six, the group that will later be dubbed that. And the Shoreline Six girls were arrested and they faced aggravated assault charges. However, through Canada's Young Offenders Act, their identities would be protected, except from Nicole and except from Grace, in my opinion, because they were more involved and then tried to dispose of the evidence of the crime. However, now those youth homegirls also told the police, well, there was one location that they kept mentioning, you know, like, oh, they're gonna go retrieve these items from the bridge. There's a bridge that kept being mentioned as a central point. So the police ended up flying a helicopter over the Craigflower Bridge area. However, they didn't see anything. That is, until they conducted a ground search. And this is when the body would emerge in the weeds. The body was positively identified as the one of Reena Virk. And this is when the coroner would determine that Reena's death was caused by drowning, that her internal injuries were comparable to somebody who had been in a car accident. The coroner would also later testify that even if Reena hadn't drowned, she probably wouldn't have survived her brain injuries. If none of this, if you are yet to feel rage, if none of this has sometimes touched your soul, I don't know, maybe seek therapy, emotional advice, emotional support, but also we now go into the aftermath, so there's no chance by the end of this video that you will not be fuming. And here, unlike with so many accounts on this case that I have seen online, I'm not just going to brush over it. I'm not just going to spend 2 minutes telling you how this case ends. Because Reena's parents didn't have that kind of opportunity. They didn't have that kind of luck. They sat for years waiting for somebody to take responsibility. They waited for somebody to pay for the murder of their daughter for years. It all started unraveling in 1998. So in February, first of all, 3 teenage girls would plead guilty to assault causing bodily harm for their roles of the attack. So that's half of the Shoreline 6. And then later on, 3 more girls would end up being convicted of the assault causing bodily harm. So between April and May of 1998, 6 teenage girls were sentenced for their roles in the beating of Reena Virk. The sentences ranged from 60 days, conditional sentences, to 1 year in jail, and then they were free for beating and possibly leaving a girl for dead, and then not cooperating with the police and not reporting this crime. Or not preventing it in the first place, which again they could have done. 60 days to 1 year in jail. This is including Nicole and Grace, from what I have read. And then as for the killers, well, there's no footage that I could find, because this is again 90s, there's no like voice recordings I could find of the arrest of Kelly's, and no affidavits. So this is all articles online, some of them tabloids, some of them not. But apparently in the interviews and at her trial, Kelly would offer a different version than Warren would. When she was first interviewed, Kelly would say that she had no doubt that Reena's killer could have been Nicole. That Nicole would always say sick stuff, just weird, demented stuff, that she wanted to bury somebody. That Nicole thought it's cool to hurt people. That Nicole thought it's cool to hurt people, and it's not. It makes you seem like a thug. Surprisingly though, Nicole was actually more loyal. To give her credit, she was actually more loyal to Kelly than Kelly was to her. They even played her like the tapes of Kelly's basically snitching on her in order to kind of put her against her. However, Nicole said, "We don't talk about murder. We just talk about cigarettes and makeup. We don't talk about violence." Thinking like the police is gonna buy that. Yeah, girls, they can't commit murder. Because they all thought that Warren is gonna go down, that he is going to get the harshest sentence. And they kind of had it there for a while. Like, Warren might have suffered one of the harshest sentences compared to like the rest, compared to how much Nicole and Pleach had gotten. However, Kelly really counted on this. What she forgot to do though, or what she had forgotten about, is that in the attempt to get everybody to dispose of the evidence, she didn't actually dispose of what will be considered as an item of significance in this story. Her own black nylon Calvin Klein jacket that was found in Kelly's closet. And the arms of the jacket were stained with salt water that was consistent with samples that were taken from where Reena had been found, where rather Reena's body had been found. Now, Kelly's justification of this is that, yes, no, this is definitely that water. But she had actually gone swimming with her jacket on. She had gone swimming in the chilling water the other day, so that would explain why her sleeves were covered in salt water. When she was confronted with multiple statements, because everybody else, apart from Nicole, who was against Kelly, knew that they had to say that she was the main perpetrator in order to get lighter sentences, Kelly would say, "This is high school. It's just rumors, rumors, rumors." However, then is when the trial proceedings begin. So Glovatsky's trial was the first one in April of 1999. He was 17 when he was accused of the murder of Reena's, and the judge ruled against the ban on the details of the case, so his name was immediately to be exposed to the public. He admitted to the beating of Reena, but he insisted he wasn't the one to kill her. A week and a half later, Kelly's trial would begin, and she will be tried as an adult. However, this won't be her only trial. It will be her first one, but then there will be a second one, and then there will be a third one. And there was almost a fourth trial in Kelly's case. And this is why we are painfully sitting in it, because Reena's parents did for years. They have actually, after, I believe, the first conviction, filed a lawsuit against the government and also against the perpetrators for somebody to be held accountable, because throughout all of these trials, Kelly will just not admit her part in doing anything, and really for the longest time Warren would blame it on Kelly as well. So none of these people were taking responsibility. So this is why the parents, the Virk parents, have filed a lawsuit. However, because of how long these legal proceedings, especially in Kelly's case, have taken, they couldn't focus on providing documents for their own legal suit, meaning that their legal suit against the government and the perpetrators was later dismissed. So they didn't get any compensation, they didn't get anything. This case is just gonna keep enraging. So, Warren's trial ends in June of 1999, and he is the only male involved in the crime, and as such, is convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 7 years. Now, second-degree murder means no intent, so they didn't intend to murder her. And I have a problem with all of these charges here, but that isn't the only problem that I have. So Warren will have no chance for parole for 7 years when he was incarcerated, and it was said that he was put immediately into participation in different programs. They immediately started focusing on rehabilitation, like restorative justice, and making sure that he does eventually get into the public, that he's able to integrate back into the society. Now, the simplest way to understand the rest of this case is to go through it in a timeline fashion. So between 1999 and really to this date. And along the way, we are going to drop off one individual and then follow up on the other, because the other one has truly lived 1,000 lives. It's just so impossible to even keep up with what Kelly has been up to between 2000 and this date. Kelly, as I mentioned, will have 3 trials. In March of 2000, she will be convicted of second-degree murder in adult court. She is sentenced to life in prison, and she has also no chance of full parole. In Kelly's case, it's for 5 years. After this conviction, the Virk family follows through with a lawsuit, and we know that this is going to be dismissed in the end, because it's not where it ends for Kelly. In 2001, after the jury found her guilty the previous year, there was a judge who praised Kelly for overwhelming love of animals. This is what is a repetitive note in this case. Like, Kelly just loved animals and poetry, and you're like, good for her. Good for her. Doesn't mean anything. Doesn't mean shit for this fucking case, but sure, good for her. And she handed down the lightest sentence possible, praising the convicted killer as young, intelligent, and from a wonderful family. Again, we know that she isn't. Like, her family is broken as well, but sure. So Kelly appeals, and in 2001, the Supreme Court of Canada overturns her conviction on the grounds that she had been improperly questioned. The only thing I could find on this is that the court ruled the Crown failed to give her a fair trial because they asked her 18 times why witnesses would give false testimony against her, and this was apparently excessive. And on the technicality, and that's all she needed, they overruled her charge. So now, Kelly is out on the streets awaiting a new trial. I cannot even picture this for the family. She's just out on bail, awaiting her second trial. In the meantime, here in 2001, Warren appeals for the first time, and he loses the appeal. He isn't granted day parole, he isn't granted anything, he's to stay behind bars. Now, this brings us to 2003, and this is when a new trial for Kelly begins. At this point, This girl is 21 years old. As I mentioned, Kelly is out on bail. Does it make sense? No, she has been charged for murder, she has been let out on bail. So she ends up being back in custody prior to her trial. Why, you might ask? Because she has been involved in an incident where she has caused bodily harm in the beating of a 58-year-old woman. Apparently, her and another young woman were drinking in a park when they invited this woman who was just chilling on a bench and was 58 years old to join them. And when they couldn't find their own cell phone, they accused this woman of stealing it. Makes you, in hindsight, question the accusations against Reena. Has Reena actually stolen Nicole's address book to call the boyfriends, or was that an invented rumor just to cause some sort of escalation? Makes you question everything, because the police said the 58-year-old was punched in the face quite viciously until she finally managed to escape and called 911. So again, we have somebody accusing somebody of what might or might not have actually happened. And that brings us to the second trial. You would think, if somebody's on bail, right? If somebody's on bail, the jury would know about this. The jury would have, even if they're trying to like block everything out, block the news out, even if the lawyers are trying not to include this in the trial, they would know that this woman was on bail and she has caused bodily harm to somebody else. She's a danger to the society, but no. The second trial of Kelly's will end up in a mistrial because the jury was deadlocked, 11-1, despite of Warren saying that Kelly was the one to kill Reena Virk, despite of the pathologist testifying that Virk's death was due to drowning. Despite of Kelly herself admitting that she has punched Reena, but saying she did so because she thought Reena was going to hurt one of her friends. Despite of Kelly denying drowning Reena because her excuse was that she thought when Reena reached the water, she was already dead. In our timeline here, in November of 2004, Warren is denied day parole yet again. And in February of 2005, Kelly goes on trial for a third time. Yet again, I don't think double jeopardy apparently exists in Canada, or it didn't at the time. Actually didn't look that up. Somebody let me know in the comments, but luckily it didn't in this case because the third trial is finally going to result in something. And here the trial would hear how the two of them went back to the bridge. And it will hear Warren again admitting here to his own part in the murder. He would be a star witness here, testifying to beating Reena with Kelly and then leaving her dead in the water. And here, I haven't seen anybody include this, so I will, because I find it extremely interesting. Every time there's like an experiment conducted, or what they called here cold simulations, I just find it super interesting. And here I'm going to give you a bit more of an in-depth account of what happened during this trial. So the defense would claim that Kelly, if she was actually in the water for about 10 minutes, making sure that Reena has drowned, she would have been uncomfortably wet. And everybody else would have noticed. Like, she went home. Her stepmother would have noticed. And her stepmother went onto the stand and said how her daughter's legs and everything like were exposed when she went home. She actually said like, oh yeah, well, Kelly returned home, but then she took a shower and then she was just on the porch chatting with me. However, her legs were not like super red, which meant that no, she couldn't have been this cold. She would have been experiencing hypothermia had this all been true. With the temperature of the water and the knowledge of what they were wearing, they then conducted these simulations, and they have involved two young females similar to Kelly. So these are the steps that they have gone through, all in an attempt, this is her defense team, all in an attempt to prove that she would have been cold, she would have been freezing, her stepmom would have noticed, and her stepmom as well conducted her own experiment where she was wearing similar clothes to what Kelly was wearing. She walked into the gorge to her waist and then remained there for a total of a couple of minutes, and then walked home as quickly as she could have. And upon arrival, her shoes had slit in them and grass had seaweed, and she was cold and shivering. She showered, but her legs were bright red, so the speculation here is Kelly would have been freezing, everybody would have noticed, and also the items of her clothing would have had some seaweed in them. But despite this bizarre-ass experiment that they have wasted their time on, I guess they tried. Their lawyers, they have to try. Here, luckily, the jury have had enough, and they had finally found Kelly Ellard guilty. She was convicted of second-degree murder in the death of Reena Virk. And now she's given life in prison, and she must serve 7 years before she can seek parole. This is 2005. This is 8 years after Reena's murder. And then in 2006, Warren is granted unescorted temporary absences from prison. So this is day parole, and I have looked a bit into eligibility just again because I was fuming during this research. I was fuming. I was like, nothing makes sense. What is up, Canada? What is up in the air? What have you been smoking in the 90s and 2000s? And apparently they were eligible for all of these paroles purely because they weren't in maximum security prisons, purely because it wasn't first-degree murder, from at least what I have read. So day parole allows them to participate in community-based activities in preparation and hope for full parole or statutory release. And they must return nightly when they're on day parole to a community-based residential facility, or what you will hear later in this story, halfway houses, unless they were authorized by the Parole Board of Canada of anything else. So after serving almost 9 years of a life sentence, Warren is granted this day parole. And the Virk family supports this decision because Warren was the one from the get-go who took responsibility. Kelly never did, not until this point at least. So in 2008, the BC Court of Appeal overturns Kelly's second-degree murder conviction and orders a fourth trial. I will put again on the screen something taken from a 60-page ruling because, again, nothing makes sense. It's again a technicality, but the lawyers have somehow successfully appealed here. So what had happened, from what I understood, is that this was due to a judge giving wrong direction to the jury. It was again just a technicality, just like in their first appeal, they aimed at the cross-examination, I believe, and how she was questioned. Here, they examined jury instructions and found something and managed to overrule it. However, now, this went to Supreme Court of Canada, and Supreme Court upheld Kelly's conviction of second-degree murder, finally ending this legal case. Finally, she was to serve the rest of her life sentence. That is, yet again, until she has the chance to apply for parole. And if you're following, we are still not even done with the first decade of 2000s, so she clearly will have the chance to do that. Kelly's conviction will be restored in June of 2009, so this is now 12 years after Reena's murder. Again, just thinking about her parents, going through this mess for 12 years. Just trials, her being out on bail, again committing offenses, again being a danger to society, again being put through the system, and then just being found, I don't know, is it luck? I don't know what the hell it is, but the parents should have definitely not had to go through all of this. And speaking of them, to finish off the story on Warren Glowatsky, he might or might not make you believe in restorative justice. Bear with me, okay? So in 2010, it was reported mostly by Vancouver Sun, so like tabloids in Canada, that Kelly and Warren had chosen different paths within prison cells. This is, again, tabloids, okay? Grain of salt. So Warren was said to have avoided trouble while in prison. He kept to himself, he volunteered, and he spoke to at-risk youth. He also became involved in restorative justice programs, and he also looked to facilitate reconciliation and just relationships between victims and offenders. He would, during his time in prison, also meet up with Reena's parents. So they would be in touch. And in an act of forgiveness, Reena's parents decided to accept his apology, and they fully supported his request for full parole. So not even just day parole, which he was granted at this point, but for his full release from prison. Reena's mom, Suman, said about this, of all of the accused in this whole process, Glovatsky was the only one who has taken responsibility for his actions. So in 2010, Warren is released on parole. He would give interviews about this, saying how at the time he called it bravado, trying to be a gangster, how he was screaming out for attention in all the wrong places, and that now he finally gets it, how he feels ashamed and he wished he could crawl under a rock. Upon his release, Reena Virk said that she can see how Glovatsky is no longer the angry, scared teenager that he once was. Today, I think we see a young man who has taken responsibility for his actions and is trying to amend the wrong that he did.
Both would be convicted of second-degree murder. Only Glovatsky would later express remorse.
I've been able to realize the hurt that I've done to people.
He testified that he stood and watched as this other individual alone dragged Reena into waist-deep water of the gorge, held her head under the surface of the water until she drowned.
So at this point in 2010, Warren is released completely. He is on full parole. And personally, do I think that he was completely honest? Do I think that he had actually been rehabilitated? That in such a short period of time he could have been reintegrated into society? Well, not such a short period of time, but still only a decade or so that he had spent in prison. Partially, yes, and that is purely because this is where we lose trail of Warren Glovatsky. I don't know if he changed his name, I don't know what had happened to him, because I couldn't find anything on him and where he is now. Which probably means that he wasn't in the system again as well. So partially, could it have worked for him? Maybe. Maybe the prison had completely changed him. Something that I don't want to see in the comments is a single negative comment against Reena's parents on their decision to forgive their daughter's murderer, at least one of them. If they have decided to forgive somebody who had killed their daughter, you don't have the right to judge that decision. Unless you have been in the exact same shoes, unless you're one of them, you don't have the right to make that decision. And that is something that I will just immediately block. If I see a single comment on that, you're blocked. You're blocked. There's no way like that you will be commenting on this kind of channel ever again. Partially though, when it comes to Warren and my honest opinion, I think everybody in this case, especially Kelly, that we're going to talk a bit more about, knew how to play their cards right. There's a formula when it comes to parole, there's a formula when it comes to appeals, appeal on technicality. When it comes to the parole board, just have to act like a good person in prison. You just have to repent. Suddenly, because he didn't repent to begin with. So I think everybody here knew to a certain degree, even though maybe they have been completely rehabilitated. At that moment in time, they knew how to play their cards right. And they knew how to do it with the parole board, who was making decisions on their behalf. That leaves us with Kelly Hellard, and I say that with utmost disgust. Because she has since lived so many lives behind prison cells, luckily, but also outside of them. So remember how I said the tabloids and how they were reporting what these two were doing in prison, when Vancouver Sun was reporting different behavior from Kelly. Apparently she was still within the prison cells behaving erratically and in a menacing way. Prison records, again according to the tabloids, reveal numerous infractions, from hoarding dozens of toothbrushes, seemingly used to make the makeshift shanks, and also confessing to a year-long binge on contraband crystal meth. Soon after she turned 30 within prison cells, she decided to quit drugs though and took a job in the prison library, where she would become pen pals with a 41-year-old man named Darwin. This brings us to 2016, when she would finally be allowed to apply for parole. And she does. And at this point in time, she was denied parole, but then the next year, she would be granted temporary escorted absences to go to parenting programs and doctor's appointments. So let us go back in time a bit, because otherwise none of this will make sense. You're like, parenting? Appointments? Yeah. So this lovely story started with the man called Darwin Dorazan. And he would be the father of at least one of Kelly's children. Multiple articles say two of them, both of Kelly's children. She would end up having two kids while in prison. But the father of those is a man with gang links, who was out on day parole when he was allowed the intimate visits, conjugal visits, with Kelly. Darwin and Kelly started off as pen pals, and from what I have gotten from the resources, Darwin was in and out of prison. He had gang links, and we'll talk about his offenses in a second, but in order for him to have had conjugal visits with Kelly, he would have had not to be an inmate. He couldn't be inside of one prison and then going to another prison to visit Kelly. Makes sense, right? So in between his prison stays and his charges for different crimes, he started visiting Kelly in prison. Kelly gets pregnant because, again, contraception. Why would you give it to inmates? Why wouldn't you just allow them to be pregnant in prison? So in 2016, like upon her first appeal for day parole, she isn't granted one. But then they hone in on her pregnancy, learn that she actually is about to give birth to a child, so the next year they allow her for day parole. And Reena's mom about this would actually say that she was just so disappointed in the system all over again, because still she's waiting for Kelly to admit her guilt. However, for the first time in the parole hearing, Kelly would take responsibility for her role in the murder. This is, again, from what I have read, 2016 or 2017. She said she was very sorry for what she had done and that Virk didn't deserve what happened to her. And Suman, Reena's mom, to this said that it comes a bit too late, that she could have taken responsibility a long time ago, saving us the pain and agony of first of all going through 3 different trials and waiting for 20 years to finally have some acknowledgement of her guilt. And you have to wonder, how come suddenly she is pregnant, she's having a child, she's appealing, and suddenly she's admitting to guilt? Again, to guilt, not gift. Again, seems calculated. Again, seems like something somebody would do in order to get day parole. Yes, both having a child and also admitting to guilt, because I think everything here has been calculated. So on the father of this child, I'm honestly only thinking here about Reena's family, the victim herself, and those kids, because I just feel so bad for the kids of these two individuals. So they started off as pen pals, right? And then conjugal visits happened, romance at its best. This is where I get confused, because Darwin, the father of the child, was serving a 7-year, 2-month sentence after pleading guilty in 2012 for 11 counts of breaking and entering, and then breaking and entering with intent. So if math serves me right, unless again he was on day parole, which I think is how this whole thing happened, he was not supposed to have conjugal visits. I think he was allowed day parole because, again, Canadian prison system, and that is how baby number 1 had been made. But then he had a lengthy criminal history, and the charges include robbery, kidnapping a drug dealer who was then tortured, shot and killed by Darwin's accomplice, and then obviously all of the violent breaking and enterings. I'm just wondering whether or not both of these kids are his. Not that it matters, again, two of the worst individuals in this whole story. But he was in and out of the prison, and as I mentioned, you can't really have conjugal visits with an inmate. So a couple of notes here. Kelly, as I mentioned, would end up having one child and then the second one. The second baby she would have from the articles that I have read in 2020. But the notes that I have put here is that she truly in my opinion, allegedly pulled a Holmes, Elizabeth Holmes, before Elizabeth Holmes pulled Elizabeth Holmes. What I'm trying to say is that I feel like she had had those kids just for the sake of getting herself out of prison, or at least getting day parole, getting herself out of the prison into the halfway houses, at least during the day, because with a child, she already gets the privileges. You get like maternal care, you get to go into programs, you get to actually be taken care of, and also for the child to be provided some sort of care, some sort of community services, specialized care, including the services of obstetricians and gynecology. Meaning not only does she get to be a mother, but she also gets privileges within prison. And this hurts because I have seen an interview by Reena Virk's mom saying how by this point she would have probably had kids. But this has been taken away from her. Reena would never be able to fulfill her dream if she ever had a dream of becoming a mother. However, her murderer can.
Virk's parents won't officially mark the anniversary of Reena's death on Sunday. Suman and Manjeet have 2 grown children and a grandchild, 9-month-old Austin, who is now the light of their lives. Suman wonders what Reena, who should have turned 27 years old this year, could have been.
Reena and how much she loved babies, and, can imagine how proud she would have been, and probably by now she would have had her own children.
So since 2017 and all the way up until this day, she has been denied full parole, and every 6 months she kind of gets an extension of like the next 6 months on day parole. And the parole board has said the reasoning for this is that the fact that the birth of your children has given you a purpose in life is tragically ironic, as you ended the life of another mother's child. But your children and the support of your common law spouse and other family members are strong protective factors. Continuing, day parole will contribute to the protection of society by helping Kelly reintegrate as a law-abiding citizen. Reena's mom would say how disappointing this is because she had never had a say. It was always up to the parole board, and as a victim, you are completely helpless. Decision entirely lies with the parole, and there's no much you can say or do as a victim.
Here's Reena's mother's reaction in an interview with CTV News.
It's disappointing that Kelly is allowed to go out and move around outside of the prison. It's very disappointing the fact that she was even able to have a child while being incarcerated.
Suman, did you have any say at all during this process as to whether she could be released?
No. The decision is entirely up to the parole board.
Now, one parole board member said this ruling is disturbing, but in light of her good behavior, it should be allowed. What do you make of that rationale and that thinking?
I think there's not really much you can do or say in this kind of circumstances as a victim of crime, because it's all the power lies with the parole board, and so as a victim you're completely helpless, and nothing that's happened surprises me, because it seems like Kelly's getting everything she wants, starting with getting a conjugal visit with her boyfriend and then now having a child. So I don't understand the rationale of the parole board or the justice system as it is. I believe that, once you are a convicted killer, you should not have the same privileges as other members of society.
Would you have wanted to have a say in this process, or would it be too painful and bring up, all the pain that you felt over the past years?
No, I don't think I would have wanted to have a say, because I really believe that it won't make a difference. The powers that be will do what they want to do regardless.
To finish off the story, to wrap it up on Kelly, because as I have mentioned, her day parole just keeps getting extended, and then she had a second child, and I don't know who she's dating or who she's seeing now, but a couple of more things have happened, because again, like I told you, she has lived a million lives. So in 2018, this is my only comic relief, please allow for it, girl is so stupid, like it just beats me. It just beats me how dumb she is. So let's say your name is Kelly Allard, right? And you have the chance, you have one chance in your life. You can change your name. What are you changing it to? She had changed her name to Carrie. From Kelly to Carrie. I just can imagine, listen, we in customer service, we suffer a lot, okay? I can imagine the poor day of whoever that admin person was, where they have gotten, probably by post, because still, late 2000s, or by email, they have just gotten a notification that somebody has changed their name from Kelly to Carrie, and they're like, oh god, we are dealing with a stupid individual. This is the kind of shit that you gossip about, because you're like, you had all of the things. Out of all of the things, this is what you decide to change your name to. But hey, why? Again, why? Because she's still in the system. I just don't understand. I just cannot understand why she changed her name. And why do it in such a stupid way? She changed it to like Carrie Marie Sim or something like that. Again, for what reason? We'll never know. We'll never know why Kelly does anything that she does. Or, sorry, Carrie, rather now. So, in 2020, she again has a second baby. Her parole gets extended for 6 months. And the conditions of her release on day parole are multiple. Like, she can't consume drugs and alcohol, she can't contact victim's family or any person involved in criminal activity and abuse, and she must continue to follow her treatment plan. And I'm telling you all of this, even though probably you kind of know roughly and it all makes sense, like what the conditions of a parole would be, because she had a bit of a hiccup in 2020. How did you expect her to behave on the streets? Why did you expect her to behave on the streets? Why did you expect this dumb individual to behave? She was on bail attacking a 58-year-old. So, anything that I could find on this is that she has broken some of those rules, and it seems to be again to do with drugs and alcohol. She was found to be under the influence, and that was kind of a hiccup. You would think like, okay, this would make me maybe insinuate something for the parole board. No. Her day parole still keeps getting extended to this very day. She gets to spend 2 nights a week at a halfway house and then 5 nights on her own, like in her own place. So again, I don't know, does she have her own house? Does she share it with a man? And truly, I don't know what to think of this anymore, because I don't know how many chances can you give somebody and they just prove when they're released to be breaking the conditions, to be breaking the conditions of the bail, breaking the conditions of the parole, and you're still like, no, let them out into the society. Who is to say that she's not going to approach the victim's family? That's kind of where I'm wondering, like, who is to say? Or that she's not going to do anything to her kid, again, when those kids start acting out. So what do you think of this? Can she actually rehabilitate and eventually, like Warren, integrate herself back into the society? I think we all know, and the parole board knows, that it would be crazy if they were to actually give her full parole, especially with her breaking all of the rules in between. But she still has the kids, she knows how to induce sympathy, and they're probably still extending her day parole because of this formula, because it just somehow works. So where is this case now? We are gonna go back to the family and wrap this case up where we started it off, with the Virks. So Reena's murder prompted conversations nationwide. It wasn't just in Canada, but her family did most of their anti-bullying work in Canada. After their daughter's death, they started several anti-bullying campaigns and inclusion programs, and they also asked for the British Columbia schools to implement anti-bullying measures. Reena's death led to creation of drop-in centers across the province of Saanich for vulnerable youths, and also it led to formation of the center at the University of Victoria that focused on issues affecting young people. The family, the Virks, they spoke about bullying to students, teachers, law enforcement professionals. And in 2009, they were honored with British Columbia's Anthony J. Halm Award of Distinction for their crime prevention and the community safety efforts. As for where they think Reena would have been, as I mentioned, the mom said that she would have probably had her own children in the interview from 2011. But her mom would never see how this case will end, as unfortunately she passed away in 2018. According to the obituary that I have seen on Suman, she had died after choking in a restaurant at the age of 58. So let me end this video with words from Reena Virk's mom, Suman. In 2018, when she spoke about her daughter's death and the impact the bullying has on young people, she had said, "For so long we were consumed with the legalities of dealing with our murdered child, the courts prolonging the cases. And it's kind of like you put your feelings and your grief on hold. And I'm finding that now I'm feeling more of the impact of losing Reena, the emotions and feelings. So actually, I'm struggling more now and missing her more. I'm sad to say that the severity and the frequency of bullying are increasing instead of decreasing." Just like Reena, who wanted to give everyone a chance, her mother chose to forgive because, in her own words, "If I don't forgive them, then I will be behaving in the same way that they did when they had no forgiveness for Reena on the night that they murdered her." And that is the tragic case of Reena Virk. Now I pass it on to you. And what do you think about this case, about the individuals involved, about especially Warren and Kelly and the rest whose names were protected? Because this case is just blood-curdling. It's just frustrating on so many levels. Do you think she will ever get full parole? Because I think that would be such a slap in the face. I think people would protest. I hope people would, but I don't know, is it luck? What is it that she had had so far? Or does she just know how to play the system because she was technically in the system from a very early age? Which again doesn't make sense. Why were you able to play the system if you are in the system for like the longest time? Nothing here makes sense. It's just senseless. And what do you think the motives were? Like, do you think it was the pack mentality and that one started it off and then the others felt like they had to join, or they're gonna look as cowards and they might be on the ground being beaten? Or do you think there was no motive? Like, do you think that one of them just decided to conjure up this plan with her best friend and they just went for it? Like, what would the motive be for Warren then? Like, that's the thing. It's like, what would the motive be for the Shoreline Six, for everybody else that was on that beach at that time? You let me know what you think, and I shall be seeing you guys shortly. So the plan is, listen, there's a schedule here, okay? We're on schedule. That I will be releasing a video every, I would say, 10 days. Like, not 2 weeks, but 10 days. So I have somebody working on some scripts at the moment. Give yourself a shout out in the comments if you want. You know who you are. Or I mean, maybe other people are working behind the scenes. I just don't know. In which case, send me those scripts, your shit. And this will allow me to work on my next deep dive. So between now and end of October, which is my birthday, because Scorpio season, of course, I will be releasing videos like every 10 days. And something culty is coming up, probably in 10 days from now. And then, I'll try to release it sort of like every 10 days to 2 weeks. My mind has gone this. I'm hungry now. I'm gonna go eat some food. Go for a walk, edit, and then get up bright and early tomorrow for work. It's life. But yeah, I shall be seeing you with something culty soon, and then shortly after that, I think another deep dive. And I think it's only logical. It's only logical for my birthday month. The deep dive is actually wild. I'm gonna be reading a book on it. Just saying, I have never heard of this story but in movies. It's kind of like the movie plot, but it actually happened in real life, and you're like, oh damn. It's that type of thing, yeah. Just a little bit of a teaser, okay? No, don't spoil it. It's about a person that is on the run. That's it. You already spoiled. They can Google "person on the run" movie idea. What do you think it would be? I wonder. No, let me know in the comment. What do you think it would be? Because I'm now interested to see if anybody would guess it. Don't guess it. Focus on this case. Don't listen to anything that I have just said in the past like 60 seconds. They don't mind. They have checked out like a long time ago. Bye guys. I will be seeing you in a week. Why'd you lose your hair like a cat? You said 10 days. You said 10 to 14 days. Maya has lost the plot and the ability to talk. Ooh, my old back and my old bones are hurting. Bye now. Bye. Bye. I'm going holiday. Yeah, I need a holiday. I definitely need one. And you will be having one next week. Sorry. Bye out. Bye, guys.